What we got here is failure to communicate, a chronic neglect of military mental health care. This is Psychiatric Casualties, how and why the military ignores the full cost of war.
Well, welcome everyone. This is Mark Russell with my colleague, Charles Figley,
Hello.
Sir Charles, and we are Psychiatric Casualties, and we're talking about the effects of denial and psychiatric casualties and the psychiatric realities of war. This is a carry on from our topic from our previous episode, this is episode 14. In episode 13, we introduced the idea of denial and what is denial and how it pertains to military mental health care and the civilian sector at large. So this is our continuation of that discussion. And also, before we get started, Charlie, I want to mention that if listeners want to get in touch with us, they want to send us any comments, they have some personal anecdote, or they have some debate about what we're saying, that they can reach us through email. That email address is mrussell, 2 S's, 2 L's, PhD @gmail.com, and we will read your responses or feedback, and we'll probably use that in subsequent episodes.
Yeah, last week we talked about the last shows before that. I think the main idea here is that we have known each other for many years, and this is kind of a conversation that we're having, that we're allowing you to come in and observe us, and hopefully we'll get something from you in terms of interaction, ideas, messages of some sort, because anything like that will certainly encourage me. I think it will encourage Mark as well. What do you think, Mark?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we'd love to hear other voices. You know, we had Charles's wife, Kat, joined us in the earlier episode. So, but it's always, for me, it's beneficial to hear other voices than my own. And I kind of get tired of listening to myself speak, to be quite honest. So we really welcome any additional information or feedback that people can provide us.
But at the same time, I need to say that you are the man, if you will, in terms of understanding military mental health and has been in the fight for what's right, what is appropriate, and that is good mental health services. And more than anyone else that I'm aware of, and you've certainly been doing it longer than anyone that I'm aware of that has fought so hard for this. And I certainly appreciate it, and you are very unusual in that regard. Now, what do you think about that assessment?
Well, the unusual part, probably people who know me would agree, but my assessment is, first of all, that I stand on the shoulders of people like yourself, Charles. And as I've said before, when I was doing my doctoral dissertation, there were very few books on trauma that were available, and yours was the ones that I gravitated to the most, and that really got me into learning more about trauma. And this is even before I became a Navy psychologist. This is while I was in training. But you know, my role in this became when I became a Navy psychologist, and then as we entered into the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that it became very evident that the military was in steep denial of the realities of war, about what was going to happen. Here we are talking about invading two countries, one of which, Iraq, which was very well armed and we thought had nuclear, biological, chemical weapons and would use it, and had a very large army, fairly well armed. And we were expecting mass physical casualties as a consequence. And we planned and prepared for that during the invasion in 2003 of Iraq. And it became very evident early on, and we talked a bit about this in other episodes, that from a psychiatric standpoint, that we were not anything close to becoming planning and preparing for meeting the mental health needs of that invasion. And that was a direct result, as of what we're calling denial of the realities that every military historian who's written about psychiatric lessons of war and all the government reports and military studies that we quote from the First World War, the Second World War, etc., all indicate that the military, the government needs to put mental health as a priority because of the toxicity of modern warfare and its limits of human endurance, and that large psychiatric casualties are to be predicted and expected given the nature of modern warfare. And yet we were not prepared. I'll give you just the extent of that denial. We talked about the DoD task force in 2007. It was a congressionally mandated task force. And let's see. Well, first of all, the Second World War, we talked about denying the realities that there are going to be large numbers of psychiatric casualties, that combat stress alone is responsible often for those psychiatric casualties. It's not due to personal weakness, not due to predispositions, etc. And the Second World War, this was the conclusion that the military leaders reached, and it was published in their two massive volumes of psychiatric lessons learned in the Second World War. Quote, defects in preparation and planning. As has been indicated already, psychiatric disorders proved to be a major source of manpower loss to the U.S. Army in World War II. At the beginning of the war, a potential loss of this magnitude was neither expected nor planned for by military authorities in general or the medical department in particular. It was not until February 1942 that a psychiatrist was even assigned to the Surgeon General's office. So after these two massive volumes of lessons learned that the U.S. military had learned from the Second World War, they concluded with this information so readily available, there can be little excuse for repetition of error in future wars should they occur. And that was a U.S. Army Surgeon General Heaton in 1966. So then we jumpstart into the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in Vietnam, we repeated the same mistakes in World War II and Korea and in the First Persian Gulf War. But here we are now in the 21st century, right? All these wars that have occurred, all the lessons learned, same thing. This is the conclusions by the DoD task force. The task force, quote, arrived at a single finding underpinning all others. The military health system lacks the fiscal resources and the fully trained personnel to fulfill its mission to support the psychological health in peacetime or fulfill the enhanced requirements imposed during times of conflict. This is about 6-7 years after the invasion of Afghanistan had already taken place. And we're now coming to this reality that we have botched it again. And their conclusion was this. This is what irks me tremendously. The time for action is now. Quote, the human and financial costs of unaddressed problems will rise dramatically over time. Our nation learned this lesson at a tragic cost in the years following the Vietnam War. Fully investing in prevention, early intervention, and effective treatment are responsibilities incumbent upon us as we endeavor to fulfill our obligation to our military service members. That's the DoD task force in 2007.
That should be emblazed on a building or something. And it's remarkable how we continue to forget this, or at least act like we forget it. Willful blindness again.
Willful blindness, denial, again, and the consequences are that we have these generational mental health crises after every major war, primarily because of that neglect of learning those lessons of the war trauma. Yeah, well documented. Again, nothing that you and I created. It's not our opinion. These are direct, and we could go quote after quote from each generation. We just don't have the time, the bandwidth, and the podcast to do that. But that's in our book. It's in our articles, things that we've written about, and we've spoken about pretty extensively. But
I was invited by a colleague of mine. He was full colonel in the Marine Corps. I think I mentioned this to you, in which it was I won't say where it was, but in any case, it was all the leaders of the Marine Corps Reserve in a particular area, section of the country. And the perception, in my opinion, was that there was denial there, even when they were there in order to get training, in order to be even more effective in what they do, et cetera, et cetera. But it was almost like, we don't want to hear it. We don't want to talk about those things because we have it mastered. Everything is going to be fine. And it wasn't fine, because the other half of the time I spent with them, they talked about all the problems. And I think they're linked. I would guess that they're linked.
Yeah, and that's what's really mind-boggling. We talk about denial from an individual standpoint, and we can talk later about where denial can be adaptive, like in a war fighter, and then maladaptive, as in military organizations, leadership, etc. It was so frustrating for me of being on active duty and seeing leaders deny repeatedly, and leading up to this 2007 DoD task force public revelations of a mental health crisis, acknowledgement finally. You had years from 2001 all the way up until that June 2007 public release of this task force findings. But all those years in between, where you had military leaders, both in the uniform and the civilian, all the way up, Surgeon General, head of military medicine, civilian defense, assistant secretary of defense and health affairs, etc., all testifying under oath to Congress, including within weeks of the June release of its own task force report, saying that we had no mental health crisis in the military, that we had the best mental health resources available, we had adequately well-trained mental health providers, we had been making inroads on reducing the effects of stigma, that people have treatment for conditions like PTSD if they want it. People are afforded evidence-based treatments. We have transition assistance, that essentially saying we had no real problems in the military. Had some problem with suicide. Okay, but we're very preventive and effective programs to even combat that. And then all the way in that, I think that was May, the last congressional testimony I saw from, I think it was the House of Representatives Armed Services Committee. And in June, just a few weeks later, you had the military and some of the same people who were testifying, the surgeon generals of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, would go and they published this DoD task force that says, we have a major crisis. We learned our lesson in Vietnam that we need to be prepared. We need to provide.
Same people?
Yeah, many of the same people. Absolutely. And instead of heads rolling, instead of Congress or the media saying, what the hell? How is this directly opposed? You have 99 recommendations of the task force, 99 corrective actions, and each of those represent diametrically oppose what you testified to under oath, that there were problems in these areas. Yet you're saying these are problems, and the sense of urgency is now. That if we don't act now, that hundreds of thousands of people will be affected and harmed, et cetera, et cetera. But yet, no accountability whatsoever. No, there was no congressional investigation into why the military had lied and denied the existence of a crisis or minimized it grossly. And then there was
no one in Congress?
Nobody in Congress, nobody in the media. Say, hey, wait a minute, you just had the sworn testimony a few weeks ago that said there wasn't really any problems and we're everything's under control and we're doing the best we've ever done in terms of mental health in this generation. And so there is a denial, not only of an individual level, obviously, and some of that again may be adaptive if you're in the warfighting environment, but of the organizational levels, not in the military, but even beyond, in Congress. And I would say even the national news media has some culpability here too. How do you let that go? In fact, people were promoted as a result of that DoD task force. People were awarded given high-level awards, medals for this transparency and this very progressive, unprecedented acknowledgement of the realities of war and realities of mental health and what we need to do to combat that. So that, for me, as a clinical psychologist, a military psychologist on the front lines, seeing waves and waves people coming in crisis, that I had to, as the only mental health provider for about a base of 6,000 Marines. And I'm also covering 2 other bases on a night watch because there's not enough staff. That was so infuriating. And that's what eventually led me to become that whistleblower again and to keep writing and talking with you about these things in this podcast. But so denial is such a problem, and it continues today, without a doubt. We're in not much better shape today, as far as mental health goes, and our policies around mental health than we were back at the beginning of the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and then go back into the first Persian Gulf War, Vietnam, Korea, First World War.
But the reason why we wrote the book is to hold people accountable. We can identify nearly every chapter, but certainly the areas, things that you've cited, same thing you've quoted.
Yeah, exactly. That was our goal, wasn't it? Is to, by publishing these articles and writing this book, and now hopefully doing this podcast too, that the information will be out there. You can't bury your head in the sand. You can't deny these problems exist. And there's been this pattern that has existed from each generation to generation since the First World War. At least that information now is available. No one can say that we didn't know about it, or that, these, right? So that, if there's anything I take to my grave, is that I made an effort at least to make a official record, if you would, that of the problems and the nature, and we talk about what can be done about it. More importantly, what can be changed, and how will that change affect the military, but also affect society in general.
We have written 19 articles or chapters.
Oh, you looked that up. Okay.
Oh yeah, and there may be earlier than 2010, but at least we started 2010. I know that for sure because I have it here. But all of them were dismantling all of the terrible things. I mean, explaining, pulling it out objectively, etc. But EMDR, obviously, when we put that together, it ended up in a book eventually. But it was talking about trying to somehow close the gap with regard to practice in terms of treatments. I mean, there just wasn't enough people that were at least trained in the effective methods, among them EMDR. But we focus on combat operational stress and behavioral health. We published there. And we go on and on. It's a very long list, and I'm not going to read all of it, but essentially not trusting that the book would do it in and of itself, we published all of these articles, and again, there may be a couple of chapters that go into detail about what we found and pull things together on numbers of occasions. And it's still happening, obviously.
Unfortunately.
I guess it's the first time we've not been at war for a while, but we're still at war in many ways.
People in harm's way, for sure.
Harm's way, yeah. Right. Yeah. So you have worked harder than anyone that I'm aware of in terms of bringing this to the attention of the American people, and in hopes of doing something about this. And how many trips have we taken? At least without going into details about our trips, I think that when we got to a point, you and I, in terms of our collaboration, in which we were ready and talking to people about suing the fucking military.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And hoping that would work. And it wasn't until your best bet, because I didn't know anything. No one was working there in Seattle, but you stop looking, right? I mean, it's not a matter of giving up. It's just a matter of saying it's not going to be possible to sue the military.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's something called the Ferris Doctrine, which
Yeah.
is still invoked. And there's been some congressional act that has modified that in certain very narrow circumstances. Military personnel, their families can sue the DoD for like medical negligence.
Very limited.
It's very narrow, like wrong site surgery or something along those lines. But when it comes to mental health, it doesn't allow, military members or their families to sue the military because of this Ferris Doctrine. But yeah, we were putting our hopes on that because in the United Kingdom, their Ministry of Defense, the equivalency of DoD, obviously, was sued by British soldiers and their families for for basically neglect due to untreated psychiatric wounds. And what led to that lawsuit, those civil actions, was a change in the laws around the tort laws that allowed the government to be sued, the military to be sued by its British soldiers. And that paved the way for a lot of significant changes in how the British military deals with deployments and level of exposure to war stress and the need to provide definitive PTSD care or mental health care, that all veterans, regardless of your status, are entitled to VA care in the British system.
In the UK, yes.
In the UK. Yeah. But yeah, so that unfortunately is not available to us in the United States. And so there's no accountability from a legal perspective, at least right now. And our efforts to find lawyers willing to do that. We said that with several groups of lawyers, but they all were very enthusiastic at first, but then they basically came back and said that, yeah, it's really not possible to sue unless you have somebody actively in the military at the time, and that there can be a real definitive link is made between violation of a certain policy and it causing a certain harm, as a result. And how many people in the military would be so far willing to do that? There probably are if people knew that was an option, but anyways, so that effort has kind of been put on ice right now just because the feedback we've gotten from lawyers has been that it's probably not worth our time to pursue this.
I remember that case. I was part of that case. I mean, I guess I was one of the consultants, at least, that was brought in initially. And I dropped out of the case, and it still continued. Well, I think it was maybe another 8 years or so, and it was a very long.
It was long. And the case you're talking about is the MOD case, right? The British lawsuit. Yeah. Because I knew that various American experts, I didn't know that you were actually involved in that, but I knew that some were, and those that were in the military or the VA or were, working for the United States government were forbidden to participate in that because they thought it was a conflict of interest, that if you had American experts who were in the government that testifying that there was negligence, is what we know about the psychiatric realities of war and what needed to be done and it wasn't done in the case of the British, but also in the case of the Americans. So that would be the conflict of interest, you see. So they were pulled back. But so I wasn't aware that you actually participated in that class action across the Atlantic.
And it's interesting because I wasn't aware that, well, yes, I was aware that if you're employees, yes. But I think I was the only American there, but there were foreigner other than British. And Sahaba Solomon was a good friend, and she was there and attended.
Israeli self-defense force, trauma expert.
Yeah. She was really I know when I started the journal, Traumatic Stress, she was on my editorial board, and I never met her and never really knew about her until, I started doing that. And she deserves a lot of credit. She's won every award I think she could win in Israel, at least. But it was, yeah, it was tough. And Kat and I talk about how much paperwork was sent to me just for my review.
Mm.
And there was, like stack of, 5 or 6 papers across, very large amount in all of these file cabinets, etc. And when I was finished with it, I was able to let go of all of that. So that was always nice. Unfortunately, I could have held on to it and we could have learned a lot from that, but I wasn't collaborating at that point in time. I was just glad to not be doing it anymore. But, I want to ask you about your experiences. I mean, you heard about what I was talking about with Kathy and talking about, the one particular research participant that I needed her to fill out the form, let me know what the high points were. I was fairly certain that I knew everything about, at least in terms of our study. But yeah, she and I had, well, another chance. It wasn't the first time, but there were a number of occasions in which she asked me about my military experience and about, certain things, certain people, etc. Have you talked about that with your spouse? Or does she want to know?
Yeah, well, I did talk to Mika about, what I was dealing with while I was stationed in a Marine Corps air base in rural Japan, where she saw firsthand. I was working almost 7 days a week. I was on pager and cell phone duty call 24/7 for 5 years. I was there, and then trying to deal with the military, and again becoming a whistleblower and talking to reporters and congressional members about military mental health crisis that the DOD and the government were denying existed until, like I said, until 2007 when they admitted it. But then subsequently didn't really fix it as far as their policies goes with mental health. They tweaked it a little bit, made it look a little better, repainted the building so it looked a little newer. But the fundamentals of mental health care in the military had not changed. So I have talked to her. I shared that with her. We've been involved in a couple of documentary films, including the one that you were involved in, the Strangers at Home. So she's been involved with it. She's had to live with me and my changes in state of mind as I blow off steam about what the military is doing or not doing. So yeah, she's pretty aware.
Well, as you know, I've been studying practitioners for a while.
Yes.
Especially in the last, 5, 6, 7 years.
Mental health practitioners, or I guess healthcare practitioners, yeah.
Primarily, but nurses and others as well.
Right. About compassion fatigue or.
Yes. Those issues.
Yeah.
But she and I talked about those things. The last people we think of are the practitioners. I mean, not you and I, and even when I was asking you about your experiences, you answered my question, but what is it like inside of you? What is it like to have to do that? Have to have done that actually 5 years ago, or 5 years at Sugi? I'm not sure which. What
it was Iwakuni in Japan.
Iwakuni, yeah.
Marine Corps Station, Iwakuni.
Yeah, and so I'm just wondering, with practitioners, I guess, let me just get back to the point here. With a client, it's perhaps one, let's say, traumatic event that they've experienced, and they go through it, and you help them in that regard. But practitioners, although they don't have direct compassion fatigue or deal with trauma directly, they're dealing with it secondarily, like you're doing and have been doing and continue to do.
Yeah.
So how do you do that?
Well,
help others, because we tell this is the mess these kids are in, but at the same time, how can we get the mess out of them? How can we enable them to move forward and move on and all that? And we do that with the EMDR, definitely.
Yeah, we do. And you have written, I think, the first book on compassion fatigue, as it's called, and kind of, again, a pioneer in that area as well. But how I deal with
How do you hold that?
the indirect effects of trauma by listening, bearing witness to people
Yeah.
who've been traumatized over and
Yeah.
over. Yeah, unfortunately, it kind of fits in with this chapter on denial, is that there's a type of denial called, like an optimistic denial, as it's referred to, where we kind of don't even identify there's a threat, and that, you know, we're going to be fine, we're not going to be affected by things. So we have this optimistic type denial. But then, you know, if that doesn't work, then I get into probably minimization, that, yeah, there's threats, you know, hearing all these stories and experiencing, you know, the intense emotions, the pain, the grief of people over and again. And I can minimize that. Okay, it's there, you know, it's real, but it's not that serious. I can deal with it. And that served me to a point until, and we'll talk about this in, I think, maybe future episodes, but when I was at that same Marine Corps Air Station, like I said, being on watch 24/7, 4 or 5 years, I was there, however long, until I broke. And that was the lessons of war, is that everybody has a breaking point. And whether it's direct combat stress or indirect, you know, stress itself, we're not immune from the long-term or the cumulative effects of stress. So I essentially broke down. The short story is I was temporarily paralyzed. I could not move. I could not speak. I was mute. I was conscious. I wasn't, you know, unconscious or anything. And I wasn't.
Old Sergeant syndrome. I mean,
It was absolutely old Sergeant syndrome to the T, to the T. And I think mental health providers, as you warned in your book and your writings on compassion fatigue, all those who are engaged in the empathic care of others, right? Carry a double-edged sword of empathy. And while it helps us connect with people and become healers, and can be a great service to others, it can also be a detriment to ourselves if we don't stop denying the realities and take kind of concerted actions of what they call self-care, right? And you outline a lot of examples of ways, you know, that people can take care of themselves to mitigate that risk.
Yeah.
But I was of that belief that, well, that risk exists for people, but other providers, but it's not me. So I carried that denial and that minimization up until that point where, okay, now it does affect me. And it affected my family, obviously, because it scared the hell out of them to have Japanese paramedics come into our home and put me on a gurney and wheel me off to the emergency room. And
it took that, right? That's what
up until that point, it was okay. It was, you know, compassion stress affects other people, but doesn't affect me. And I bet, you know, my last nickel, that most mental health providers or healthcare providers in general probably harbor that view, right? And then you looked at it as a perception of weakness.
Yes.
Right. And that's why Cat was
ineffectiveness. Yes.
Yeah.
They can't handle it. They can't manage effectively. They can't control it. They don't know when to stop or when to, you know, blah, blah, blah. I mean, there can go on and on about blame, but
yeah,
you got to find out where I mean, for me, I, in contrast to you, I called on my wife. Could you go do this? I can't think I can do this now. And I'm very fortunate. I mean, we're both fortunate to have great spouses that are
absolutely keep each other honest.
Exactly, move through the bullshit and get to a place where, you know, we're speaking the truth. Although anymore in the last, you know, half of our marriage, I've been very clear about what I need and what I have to work on, and have been. I mean, I'm much better, actually. Still not all the way there, but nonetheless, yeah, I feel good about that.
Yeah, I think once we can burst the denial bubble.
Yeah.
And whether you're a soldier, a Marine, or you're a psychiatrist, psychologist, or you're a physician, nurse, or whatever, you know, a chaplain or whatever, your wake in life, right? That once you pierce that bubble of denial, and you realize that, yeah, I am vulnerable. I need to do something. If not for me, if for my family's sake, then, I think you can be on a healthier trajectory. Is that what you're describing? But yeah, for many of us, for me in particular, it took a hard lesson learned. I had to be knocked off my feet literally before I said, okay, this is real. And yeah,
Dude, you're
I'm
alive.
not immune from it.
You're alive.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
There was this instinct inside of you. I mean, really, it's you. You're very fortunate.
Yeah.
There were no one that could do what you did for 5 years, dude. Come on.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah.
they do it horribly, but
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I thought I was dying, to be honest. When I couldn't move and I couldn't speak and I had all these other weird sensations, I thought, okay, I'm having a stroke, or, I'm not long for this world anymore. And so, yeah, it took like a life shaking event to say, okay, I gotta stop denying the realities of chronic stress and start dealing with it.
I here and at Purdue University worked at hospitals, students working there, supervising, et cetera, et cetera. And I've seen cases like that on stretchers and what happened to them. And they talk about the immobilization. It's frightening, really scary kind of thing you never want to do again. So,
Well, I'm not in clinical practice anymore. So that's one ways I dealt with it after I got out of the military is I've avoided exposure to, the day-to-day kind of life of a clinician where I haven't done therapy since I left the military. And that was intentional. I don't want to do that again.
Okay, well, let me ask you a question. So you feel that if you are a clinician and you are assessing, right?
Yeah.
For specific protocol, et cetera, then that should be okay. But haven't you, in any time when you're interviewing them, just for the minimal kinds of information, that they touch upon things that remind you of another client that you've had and blah, blah,
Sure.
blah?
Oh, you bet. Yeah, there's no.
How do you do that? I mean, how can you get through that?
I can get through it. I can minimize the risk.
Same thing.
Yeah. Whereas, an assessment and evaluation, like I'm doing VA disability exams, you hear a lot of stories and things that can trigger memories of other clients or my own experiences, but I don't have to try to help that person manage and see them week after week in the
Assessing.
Yeah. So it's really kind of more of a clinical assessment. I can stay more left brain and I can control the amount of exposure, if you would, by the questions I would ask, because my job there is to evaluate, come up with maybe a diagnosis or something like that. It's not to treat and have to go back and help the person, retell their trauma narrative over and again and bear witness to that. So that to me, I found I could no longer do or wanted to do. So that was my way of dealing with it. But I want to touch on, if I can, about the adaptive effects of denial, because we're talking mostly about the maladaptive aspects of denial. And I think it's more, if you had a balance, I guess, a ledger, it would far outweigh the harmful effects of denial, far outweigh the benefits of denial. But in the case of military personnel or policemen or firemen, first responders, right? Some denial would be considered to be adaptive, and in the sense of minimizing the risk or not really acknowledging the risk to self that exists in order to carry on your mission, whether it's a combat mission or it's your mission as a first responder, to expose yourself to dangerous stimuli, threats out there. But if we didn't have that level of denial, it would keep a lot of people from being able to do their jobs, if you would, these dangerous jobs. So in a sense, denial has at least a short-term benefit, right? To allow us to take on tasks that are potentially threatening or actually threatening. But then there's always that cost if that denial continues, and then we have problems and symptoms or things that are that we deny the existence of how that exposure is affecting us, then that is where it tips over to being more maladaptive and more harmful to us, individuals or families or society.
It just seems like that definitely deserves to be a book topic. I'm just not quite sure what is written about that, because you even said we do this naturally because we believe blah blah blah, and when that doesn't work, that's the challenge. So
yeah,
but it seems like in terms of building a whatever it is that you don't have to deny. In other words, a tolerance, a acceptance, whatever that is. It seems like there has to be military training to enable that to happen.
oh
right? Be
yeah.
able to. So if that's the case, then there has to be nuanced. There has to be some way, a strategy for kind of shaping it to make it work for you.
Yeah, I think from the military perspective, one, denial is absolutely, we train to reinforce denial, right? And war fighters. Well, you're a devil dog, right? You're gonna charge the hills, you're gonna follow orders and kill or be killed. In those scenarios, denial serves a purpose, right? It helps you get through that and override that life instinct, right? The fear of death and so on, which is still present. But if you are absorbed by the fear of death and anxiety and being in a high threat environment, you become immobilized or paralyzed, or certainly at the least, you become affected where you're paying more attention to the threats than you are to the buddy next to you on your left or your right. And therefore you jeopardize their safety as well as yours, because you're too self-absorbed with potential threats that exist around you. So denying the existence of those threats or minimizing it has a distinct purpose. The military wants to reinforce that over and again.
So it's hard to override fear.
Yeah, I think most people would say, I've read this and heard people talk about, these are from combat veterans, is that they're afraid. Many of them will admit that I feel fear, but then I looked at the mission, looked at the person next to me, and I didn't want to let them down. And so, I went forward with it despite the fear I might have felt. So
one quick thing, and what reminded me flashback when I was in the Marine Corps. Do you went through San Diego, right?
I did, yeah.
Do you remember jumping off of a ship? That exercise?
Yes, yeah. That was scary.
Jesus, but I did it.
Yeah.
Well, it's not that a lot of that though was associated with other people, and everyone did it. There were a few that were clingers, but overall everyone did it. But I was just amazed.
Well, that's the training, like the obstacle course. Remember the obstacle course?
I love it.
The towers you have to climb up. I don't know how many, 50, 60 feet or whatever, right? It's really tall tower. Then you got to swing your leg over the top of it. And you look down, it's like, that's going to be, it could be a potentially fatal fall. Slip and fall. But somehow or another, most of us get through that fear and are able to swing our leg and come down the other side of the obstacle course, or jump off a ship or a high tower, or off a simulated parachute jump, or a ship that's on fire. You're doing damage control and the ship is flooding, and so they got people in there. The alarms are blowing up. All that's intended to simulate, gas masks, right? All that's intended to simulate fear, and our ability to manage that and to continue on our mission. And the people around us, like you were saying, the positive peer pressure is that everybody else is doing this, so I can't be the weak one. And so it reinforces, again, one of the stigma of weakness. If you say I can, I won't. But it also prepares us for being in kind of high threat environments, and that are going to evoke fear, but that allows us to still carry on despite that fear response. Right. So that, again, denial is being reinforced and encouraged. Where it becomes harmful is then when you're not in a high threat environment anymore and you're still having those reactions.
Memories,
And
yes.
then you don't know what to do with those, or you deny those exist up to the point like where you collapse, or you have some type of, think of suicide, or you become immobilized like I did or something.
Yeah, there's all kinds of negative
All the
consequences.
scenarios, right? The fallout.
Well, what are we focusing on next? Chapter 7, Purging Weakness.
Yes. Oh yeah. One of my favorite chapters.
Yeah. And well, that's because you were an officer. See, I was
enlisted before I was an officer.
Yeah, that's true. In the Marine Corps. That's right. But this has been great. I think I've learned a lot. And I think that we all agree that dread, fear, any of those sorts of elements happen. And they certainly happen whether we like it or not.
Yeah, part of our nature. And so is denial. But where it becomes harmful is like what Anna Freud talked about, is that it becomes we over rely on that very primitive defense mechanism of denial. And that's, where we kind of start running among like the psychotic people who would tend to deny reality. That denial of reality is in the long term going to be very harmful to us individuals, our families, and then certainly the military and society. So that's the lesson we're drawing from in this chapter, is that recognizing the difference between adaptive and maladaptive denial.
Yep, I agree. So
here we are. If people want to come, talk to us, send us some feedback, again, share your views and whatnot, we would very much appreciate hearing from you. And the way to contact us is, best way is through email, and that email address is mrussell, 2 S's, 2 L's, PhD @gmail.com. And then we'll take each of those, and we may talk about that in future episodes.
That would be great.
Yeah.
All right. So long, everyone.
Okay. Yeah. You all take care, everybody, and we'll come back at this again, Charles, talk about purging weakness next month.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. All right. Take care now.